Answer quickly. Who's this guy? And this one? And this woman? And these people? Now, who are these people? That's more difficult, right? Well, they're all part of the same ancient tradition, telling stories through illustration. Long before superhero sagas conquered the world, humans were already using figures and colors to record their daily lives, immortalize their triumphs, and imagine new worlds. But combining drawings and dialogue in a sequenced story, what today we call a comic, is a much more recent art form that came about in the 19th century, and since then has taken us on a long journey through fantasy worlds. It's a journey that, while helping us fly towards the future, also has its roots deep in the past. It's difficult to pinpoint the origins of serial illustrated stories. For some historians, medieval European altarpieces and paintings in Eastern temples were the true pioneers of comics. The purpose of these works was very clear: to indoctrinate and intimidate the faithful. But that tradition stretches even further back. Take a look at these guys. To the Sumerians 4,500 years ago, who created this carved history known as the Standard of Ur, they were superheroes. In ancient Egypt, the lives of the empire's greatest figures illustrated the walls of temples and tombs. But there were other, more fascinating things, such as astrological predictions and gossip about the kingdom, that were also recorded for posterity. In this hieroglyphic from 3,000 years ago, its creator advises, "Don't blame beer for the mean words you say." As you can see, this is still a very relevant topic. The Greeks and Romans also used illustrations and bas-reliefs, which is why many of their great stories have survived. Studies show that the literacy rate in medieval Europe was below 10%, and the few books produced by hand didn't reach the masses. That changed in 1440 with Gutenberg's printing press, which could print hundreds of publications each month. In the 18th century, liberal winds spread newspapers and satirical magazines across countries such as Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Kings, priests, nobles, and public servants, no one could escape from the texts and caricatures that ridiculed power. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, a simple and wonderful creation gave birth to the contemporary comic aesthetic. In 1895, Richard Felton launched Yellow Kid, his most well-known character. And, for the first time in comic history, he used speech bubbles. In the early decades of modern comic strips, the characters could be animals, humans, or even objects, but the stories were almost always rooted in reality. However, something else was also happening in the real world. 2 world wars and the crash of the New York Stock Exchange plunged the world into a period of despair and crisis. And people started turning to fantasy to forget about their problems. It was in this context that superheroes emerged. The first, in 1936, was the Phantom. But it wasn't until 2 years later, at the hands of duo Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, that we first met the superhero who would change comic book history. Based on archetypes from ancient mythology, these characters didn't just save the planet, they also saved the publishing industry. Year after year, more and more powerful publishers, such as Marvel and DC Comics, flooded the market with new characters. In the mid-1960s, 10 of the 12 best-selling comic books in the United States were superhero comics. In Europe, Latin America, and Asia, all around the world, a multi-million-dollar industry was growing that was full of colors and cultural references of its own. Since then, comics have also given a voice to other types of characters. many of the stories became something that went beyond the page, becoming symbols of democracy, freedom, and other values that unite us and which have shaped our history. Whether they feature fantastical worlds or mundane ones, these narratives full of color and imagination help us to tell the stories of our daily lives, to immortalize our successes and failures, and to understand our place in the world, just like they have throughout all of history.